Hello, huddlers. In our peer huddles, we talk a lot about what's working and occasionally about what's not. But what we rarely dive into is failure, a topic that is naturally tough to admit out loud. And when most of us hear fail, we brace for impact, like an angry board or a broken brand promise with a consumer or that budget that just got cut. However, today I want to invite you to reconsider that word entirely. And to help us do that, I'm thrilled to be joined by someone who has redefined what it means to fail and fail well. Yes, that word is right, fail well. She is the author of The Right Kind of Wrong. I'm holding the hard copy, but I did listen to it. A Harvard Business School professor and world-renowned thinker on psychological safety and organizational learning. So welcome, Dr. Amy Edmondson.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So now, first of all, how are you and where are you this fine day?
Well, I'm fine. I'm in my office at Harvard Business School. It's a little on the chilly side here in Boston, but it's a beautiful day.
There you go. Kind of like us in New York. So let's kick things off with where things go off the rails. And especially with expectations. And this is, again, I'm going to sort of bring us to marketing leaders. I know your research is much broader than that. But in this virtual room of ours right here, they all got there by performing well, avoiding screw-ups, and yes, delivering results. So there's this paradox. How do high-achieving, results-driven leaders like these make space for intelligent failure without feeling like, well, failures?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to reframe it not so much as a paradox, but as a challenge. I mean, because a paradox implies really two things that should not or cannot be true at the same time. And truthfully, as I look at high achievers, successful people in any sphere that you name, these are not the people who've failed less often. They're the people who have failed more often than the rest of us. And that doesn't mean big, bad, ugly, embarrassing failures. It means what you said in the intro, failing well. And so it really does depend on the definition of failing well, or what I call intelligent failures. And I suspect that your listeners will agree with this premise, right? That if you're not taking what we might rightly call smart risks, you're not doing your job, in terms of it at the very highest level you could be doing it. So what's a smart risk, right? It's one that it's not a risk if you know exactly how it's going to turn out, right? That's just an action, right? But if it's a risk, that means there is at least a possibility that it won't work out in your preferred manner, right? That it will be. So I define a failure as an undesired result. Pretty simple. But an intelligent failure is an undesired result in new territory. And it could be new to the world or new for you. You haven't done this before, but it seems worth doing. And you've got good reason to believe what you're about to do might work out, but you're well aware that it might not. And importantly, the intelligent failure is no bigger than necessary, right? We don't want you to take bets that could threaten your livelihood or lead to a reputational harm that you can never recover from, right? We want smart failures are those that are just big enough to learn and get us into new terrain, but no bigger than necessary for that learning.
We're not necessarily trying for new Coke here, a catastrophic failure.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the problem with New Coke was that it was too big, right? Probably every other aspect of it would hit my four criteria, right? New territory, hadn't tried that before, so in pursuit of a goal, sales, excitement, some reason to believe this was what people wanted. Um, but the size of the failure was much bigger. And, we're still talking about it so many years later. So, ideally, we would test that in smaller representative settings and figure that out before we have to go live, if you will.
Yeah. There used to be this thing called test marketing, and that would be something that you would have done,
Right,
and that
right.
could have managed that risk, if you will. And, one of the things that in your book, there are all sorts of stories like the heart surgeons who failed and failed and failed until they successfully did a
Right,
transplant. That's life or death, and those are big
right,
failures.
right,
Or say
right,
the Challenger failure.
right,
Those are big.
right.
Those are not happening in marketing, hopefully.
No, let's hope. Yes.
So let's I think it would be helpful to sort of break down because you talk about types of failure. I think that's a
Sure.
good groundwork, basic, complex, intelligent. Can you just
Absolutely.
code those for us?
I think that's a great idea because I will say just before I get there, but I'll come back to it. Challenger is not a smart failure. In fact, it's almost the poster child for not smart failure, despite the very, very smart people involved. So the three kinds of failure that I've identified in my research are basic, complex, and intelligent. I've already described the intelligent, new territory in pursuit of a goal with a hypothesis no bigger than necessary. Those are the bread and butter of every great professional athlete, scientist, entrepreneur, etc. That's what they do to be great along the way, right? A basic failure, and yes, these are worth preventing and avoiding if humanly possible. We all make mistakes, but a basic failure is a preventable failure in familiar context that has a simple single cause, usually human error. Like we have a recipe, but oops, we put in sugar instead of salt, right? And the result is lousy. Those with training, with caution, with vigilance, with teamwork, we can truly prevent those in our organizations and even in our careers. Some will slip through, but that's okay. Hopefully not big ones. And then complex failures are multi-causal. They're the perfect storms. They're the failures that happen when a handful of contributing factors come together in just the wrong way. And any one of the factors on its own would probably not produce the failure, but the way they came together. Now, complex failures are on the rise, and complex failures often have some one or more of those factors might be, in fact, preventable, meaning things we should have known better. So let's go back to Challenger. Challenger is the quintessential complex failure. First of all, it's a very complex activity, sending a spacecraft out to orbit the Earth is a pretty complex activity with thousands and thousands of interacting parts and human ingenuity and weather and everything else, right? But what shifts it to, it's complex for that reason because there are many factors that came together, the most dominant of which was the O-ring inadequacy, the inadequacy of that material to deal with overly cold temperatures. But what makes it a preventable complex failure was the fact that the engineers who had concerns were not listened to. So that becomes a sort of an organizational thing that we can dig into further, right? When and how and why it's so important for people to be listened to, because it's hard for people to speak up with concerns or questions, dissenting views. So we have to make it easier so that we don't get challengers in our own lives and organizations. But the open heart surgery, I deliberately opened chapter one of the book with the open heart surgery because the early days of open heart surgery absolutely qualify as intelligent failure. But then you might say, well, wait a minute. Okay, I get it. New territory in pursuit of a goal, life-saving treatment with a hypothesis, reason to believe this might work. But how do you keep it small, right? How on earth can you reduce the stakes, given that they're life and death, to be low enough to be willing to risk it? And the answer is easy in retrospect. You only are willing to do that in those early days with patients who literally had no other choice, right? They're going to die. They're going to die because of a hole in their heart or, some other terrible condition. So they're either going to die, in the surgery or they're going to die soon. And so those are the ones you're willing to take this very real risk and hope you can save their lives, but know that if you haven't, it was a tolerable risk. Right. So it's a kind of almost counterintuitive, but
Right.
but still fits the formula. And of course today in 2025, we take open heart surgery absolutely for granted in a modern miracle that has saved, countless lives. And we are grateful that those early pioneers in the early 50s were willing to do the hard work of venturing into new territory.
It's so interesting. And, you're absolutely right. And as you're reading that, you go, yeah, this is so common. I mean, that just, and you don't really go back to, well, how many people, how many mistakes, or if you will, failures were there along the way?
Yeah.
Um,
Actually, can I just jump on that one because I one of my pet peeves is the interchangeability in most of
right.
our language in business between mistake and failure, and they are not the same thing. Right? A mistake is an unintended deviation from existing knowledge, protocol, practice, rules, right? So mistakes can only happen in familiar territory, and we're fallible human beings, so we do and will make mistakes, but um, not all mistakes lead to failures, and not all failures are caused by mistakes. So they're really very different. And mistake is a sort of a process deviation, whereas a failure is an outcome that we much preferred not to have happened.
I can't promise I won't make that mistake
No,
again.
no, yeah, nor can I. But actually, I can, but most people won't. But still,
Uh,
conceptually, it's fun to play with, don't you think?
yes, I hear you, and I appreciate the differences. And as I recall from the book, and I'm thinking of a basic failure in marketing. We've all gotten the emails that say "dear name,"
Yeah, yeah.
right?
All right.
And
That's a basic failure.
that's a
Absolutely.
basic failure, right?
Yep.
The system
Yep.
didn't grab the name and it still went out, and there was
Hmm.
no way
Hmm.
of
Yep.
doing it.
And we know how, right?
Right.
That's preventable. Yeah.
So yes, and it's preventable. Uh, Obviously, the complex failures are one that uh, I think CMOs actually think about a fair amount in terms of the things that could really go wrong, particularly in situations like live events or other things where
Yes.
they're dependent on technology, they're dependent on people, they're dependent on all sorts of other things. Uh, I think the area, though, that is the most fruitful for us here is intelligence and failure, and what that looks like. You've talked a little bit about psychological safety. I feel like we need to cover that importantly because honestly, I don't think there's a lot of psychological safety for CMOs today.
Yep.
There are
Yep.
CEOs, particularly if you're at a PE firm, it's about the numbers. You're gonna lose your job in
Yep.
18 months. There's no safety. And so I wonder, can you actually be a proponent of intelligent failure when you know your CEO and your board does not have your back, that there is no risk tolerance, if you will, necessarily. They might say it, but we don't
Yes.
have.
I think there is I hope this is I hope this is a familiar and compelling term to all of you, but I think there is room for sales here. I mean, I think we really do. I think CMOs have to educate or sell people on the value of smart experiments and smart risks because there's a way to think about this, which is that most people, most of the time, are playing not to lose, right? They're finding the safe zone and, okay, here are the targets I'm going to hit, setting them lower than, would be the ambitious goal because the perceived consequences of missing are just too great to bear, right? So we have people playing not to lose. We have people playing not to lose kind of in their formal targets and so forth and in their interpersonal interactions. And I think we need to sell people on the value and even occasionally, joy of playing to win instead, of being willing to go for that which you really hope and believe is possible, rather than holding yourself and your team back. But in order to do that, you have to be willing to acknowledge and talk about the very real possibility that will fail, right? Again, smart, small failure. But so I think CMOs have to sell people, including the CEO, including their direct reports, on the necessity of smart risks in a constantly changing and highly uncertain world, right? If we're not venturing into new territory, we won't fail today, but we will fail in the longer term, right? We then are vulnerable to a different kind of failure, which is the failure of obsolescence or irrelevance as the world changes around us.
Well, here's the irony, and I'm going to throw this out there. So, in a world where the clock is ticking and you might only have 18 months no matter what, you might as well take your big swings.
That's right. That's right. I
Because,
mean, go for it, right? Aim
if you
high.
don't go for it
Yeah.
and you go down,
Right.
well, you sort of look back and you go, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't take the big swing. So playing to win. Let's get at this issue of psychological safety and start first with the leaders who do this well and how they build this in the team and what CMOs need to know about that notion.
Yes. So psychological safety, again, it's gotten so much attention that that means it's also gotten lots of misunderstanding, which is, understandable. But psychological safety refers to a climate where people believe that candor is expected, right? So in a sense, I like to think of it as a learning environment, but it's a pretty challenging environment. It's an environment where people disagree, where there's conflict, where they're speaking up, where people are willing to take the sometimes challenging interpersonal risks so as to mitigate the business risks, right? Because most of the business failures I've studied were utterly preventable had people been willing to speak up in a timely way. And 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 so psychological safety describes an environment which is not the norm, but which is doable, where people just know that, yeah, we're going to expect to be a little uncomfortable, but my colleagues expect me to say what I'm really thinking here. Politely, of course, with respect, but to speak up early and often so that we can have the smartest possible risks, that are, I like to say, in an uncertain world, your success depends on high quality bets. Now, if you don't like the word bets, you can use the word decisions instead, but make no mistake, they're bets. And so, where do you get high quality decisions? Well, you get them from high quality conversations, and those are, in a word, candid conversations. So, psychological safety is important in this conversation for two reasons. One, it really does help us avoid preventable failures, probably like New Coke, like Challenger. And secondly, it creates an environment where we're more able and willing to experiment, right? To take smart risks.
Yes. Okay. So as a CMO, a leader of a team, you have people on your team that you want to encourage to experiment, to make bets, to take risks. We talk a lot about trying to carve out parts of the budget for
Yeah,
experimentation, 10 to 20% of it. And some are very good at getting these dollars and getting the CFO to understand why these dollars are necessary because the markets are changing so quickly. But I think where they could use some guidance and help is the processes so we say to the team, we want to innovate, we want to do new things, and it's going to be okay. You can take some
yeah,
big bets.
right.
Talk a little bit about sort of, all right, it's a safe environment. Great. Now what? I mean, we
Now
got to
what?
get,
Yeah.
we want intelligent success.
Right, right, we do. I mean, and make no mistake, I am a fan of success, right? But
Right.
this, success is first choice. And you've got to be willing to accept the other outcome as a possibility, or else you won't be brave enough, bold enough, creative enough. Even to say we love to say we value creativity, but we don't, right? We value conformity unless you work pretty hard to create the conditions whereby creativity is really welcome, because with creativity comes the very real possibility that, oops, that was creative, but not very successful. So, we have a lot of mixed messages in organizations, and I think we should be more scientific about it. Like, just be very clear that, and we can even be clear, as you were before, about the percent, that if we're spending 20% of our budget on experimentation, that's a very specific number. And that helps frame it for people that, yeah, we kind of expect and hope 80% to be delivering as expected because it's a little bit better understood, more familiar territory. But we're totally okay with the fact that the 20% is experimentation. And if all of your experiments work, or I'll even just say it single, if your experiment works, I mean, if you know in advance that your experiment is going to work, it's not an experiment. Then it goes in the other, then it goes back in the 80%, right? So it truly, you have to be honest, right? Your experiment can't be a kind of, ooh, look, here's my experiment, but it's really a playing not to lose moment, right? It's gonna work. If you know for sure it's gonna work, you're not doing it.
And as you're talking about this, there's another sort of internal conflict. I think there is some fear among CMOs that this need to be right.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could be crippling in this context, because I think if a junior person comes to them and says, "I'm thinking of this experiment. Here are the things," that the CMO may very quickly say, "You know what? We tried this my last job. It's not going to work. Here's why. I'm right. You're
Yeah.
wrong. Next." And
Yeah.
I guess where what they really sort of need to do is stop and sort of say, no, 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 don't, ask the questions, make sure that you are, in
Yeah.
fact, open to being wrong.
Right. You've got to be open to being wrong. And I'll go back to high quality bets depend on high quality conversations. And that was not one. Right. If you've just had a conversation where someone says, how about this? And you say, we tried that, that didn't work. That is the poster child of not high quality conversation, right? There wasn't really, there was no curiosity. There was no, ooh, tell me more. What are you thinking? And we may have tried something like it before, but almost by definition, we haven't tried it exactly before because it's a new moment. It's a new era. It's a new market, et cetera. So you've got to be willing to listen with curiosity. Most of us, and I include myself, we listen with judgment, right? And we've learned judgment. That was some sense that's how we got here. That's what made you successful was your sort of ability to exercise judgment. But that judgment has to be moderated by the reality that every day is truly new in some small, sometimes larger way. So we haven't stood in this river before. So listen with curiosity. Where's the little, and maybe the idea is not yet fully ready for prime time, but there's a gem in there or just a kernel of an idea that you in that high quality conversation can build on, can think through. Or if it's something that truly exactly has been tried before, it's okay to say so, but describe it fully. Your job as a manager is to educate that person, not to say we did it before, doesn't work, dismissed, right? But to talk through and say, here's how we were thinking. This is what we tried. What do this is what we concluded. What do you think? Like maybe, because I don't know, maybe even your conclusions weren't fully right. So yes, you must overcome that desire, which we all have, to be right. You have to decide whether you're more interested in being right or more interested in being effective and being a good leader. And most of us would just say, oh, I want to be effective. I want to be a good leader. But then our sort of theory and use, our behavior that's exhibited is more along the, actually, I really want to be right.
I have found the most useful saying in my career is, "I was wrong before, I'm smarter now." It just
Yes,
it
yes,
just
yes.
takes all the
Oh,
pressure off of
yeah.
this consistent need to be right, and opens up the possibility of learning. So one of the stories that you tell in the book, I think, is particularly relevant for marketers, and it's the Barb Nicole Veuve Clicquot story. And because in that story, I heard, oh my God, that was a whole influencer campaign because you got the celebrities to use it, and there's an expansion campaign. And I'm just wondering, from maybe there's some part of that story that you could share, that folks
Sure.
who haven't read the book yet would find
I
fun and
love,
exciting and interesting.
oh, I had, I assumed you were going to say one of the other more familiar stories. And I love that you go to Barb Nicole because it's Barb Nicole Ponsardin Clicquot, otherwise known as the Veuve Clicquot, who essentially created an industry. And both, but let me say the reason why I love that you went there is that the word marketing probably didn't exist
Right.
in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So this was really truly, a pioneering entrepreneur and ultimately business leader who was ahead of her time in many ways in engaging in the practices that you just alluded to. Why I use it, and I use it in the final chapter of the book as the opening story, is because we now look back and it's clear that Barb Nicole and Veuve Clicquot were, to say success is understating it, a remarkable success. The company was and still is successful. It essentially created this sort of global industry and as you say, through influencing tactics, got people interested and associated this beverage with celebration. Little bit of luck at various points where say the end of a war, getting in there quickly. So this could be sort of associated with that kind of celebration, or the very famous comet that people were quite interested in those days when, a particularly interesting astrological event was going to happen. They made a special cork with the comet on it, and on and on it goes. But the reason I tell this story, because this all sounds pretty successful, and we know in retrospect it was, but Barb Nicole's journey from becoming a young widow in her 20s, unexpectedly and devastatingly, because this was the dream, this company was the dream of her and her husband, Francois, um, this is not a story of success after success. It is truly a story of failure after failure, technologically, marketing, weather-wise, ships sinking. I mean, you almost can't get your head around the many failures that she endured along the way to ultimate stunning success. So it's certainly many entrepreneurs can identify with that, but I had not, until you asked me that question, thought of it as a marketing story.
In so many ways. First of all, creating a category is something that a lot of marketers think about. The
Yeah,
moment the comment thing is very much today. It's, in the moment of social, what's the zeitgeist happening? How do you grab on that?
yep,
Influencer marketing. But I also thought, what struck me so much was women weren't supposed to be running companies. It wasn't
right.
even necessarily a legal thing
Right. It was
for
only legal if you were a widow,
right. And
right? So
so
you couldn't be in that position unless you were a widow. So she capitalized on that legal, opening.
and somehow convince somebody to, this is the same challenge that women entrepreneurs have going to VCs and saying, hey, I want
Yeah.
money. Their male counterparts find it a lot easier. So somehow she managed to the equivalent of raise VC capital in the 1700s.
Absolutely. And she figured out how to make the champagne not cloudy, but clear, which is a pretty huge breakthrough. And now we wouldn't even imagine it being cloudy.
Amazing. Okay. Well, that was a fun little thing, and we'll celebrate afterwards with a bottle. It happens, by the way, that is my wife and our favorite champagne. So, I just had to get to that. And the the notion of it, these were big risks. And so uh, you talk about this sort of manageable thing. And I want to get uh, this is really interesting right now, and it's probably a good transition. So CMOs have been at the forefront of adopting generative AI for content creation and so
Mm,
forth. And they are in the moment where they could bridge and actually go to organizational transformation. And because they've been using these tools earlier, more efficiently, more effectively than most other departments. And
hmm.
so, but there's going to be a lot of intelligent failures or the need for
Right,
it, right? As we
right.
sort of figure out what can these things do that we could never do before. And when you go into new ground like that, it is likely that you're going to not, it's not going to be sick. Everyone's not going to work. So this is a moment where experimentation should be rampant. And I'm
Yeah,
just curious
yeah.
as we look at it this way in this brave new world of generative AI. I'm just going to go back to this process of failure, of
Yes,
intelligent failure
yeah.
and experimentation.
I think this is a lovely domain, and of course, it all started to accelerate well after the book came out. But it is something that it's fun to play with here. So Gen AI, clearly by almost by definition, what most of us are doing is experimenting, right? Because it's not, we don't yet have the protocols all worked out for what we should do, shouldn't do, where it works, where it doesn't. But we're experimenting and we're learning a lot in that experimentation. But to ensure, as a CMO, that that your experimentation and your team's experimentation is intelligent, let's just think through the four criteria. New territory. Well, that's a given. In pursuit of a goal. Well, I hope so. Yes. And there are probably opportunities to sharpen that goal, to be very clear about what we're trying to do with this experimentation. What are we hoping to gain? Not just, okay, we're playing around with it for fun, but in fact, we want to gain efficiencies or we want to gain more creativity or whatever it is. Like be clear about it so that people are designing the right experiments. And the third criterion is being thoughtful or being in, smart in the hypotheses. You should have good reason to believe this might work. And how do you get to the state where you have good reason to believe this might work? Usually from talking to other people. I like to say this is a team sport. It's from sort of thinking through what do we know, what do we not know, what's worth trying, and then finally, how do we help people in the organizations to keep them as, no bigger than necessary, right? The last thing we want is some, catastrophic failure that could have been avoided. So we don't want to take giant risks in new territory. We want to take small ones. And I think that too is probably subject to thoughtful conversation among other colleagues.
I want to go to the number two, the goal thing, because what's interesting
Yeah,
about so if you we were talking a year and a half ago when we were talking about what are CMOs doing with generative AI, it would have been just, hey, I got my team and they're all playing.
they're
And
playing,
they're
right,
playing, they're
right.
playing. And it was not, there was a lot of experimentation, but it wasn't in pursuit of a goal.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. And
so
now it's time to shift gears, I think.
yeah, but in truth, it was always time to shift gears. What's tricky with this
Yeah,
tool is it's hard to imagine if you don't kind of know, well, what can they do?
right.
But still,
But
and so it was a tools first approach, and what we're trying
right.
to get to is a strategy first approach.
Yes. So it should be, the goal should be consistent with or in support of the overall strategy of the company, but probably strategy of the marketing group as well. And um, I think fundamentally there's sort of the goals of divergence and the goals of convergence. The goals of convergence are related to efficiency, doing what we do, but at lower cost or maybe greater speed. And then the goals of divergence are the goals of finding new things to do that we haven't tried yet that might yield fruit. So those are the opportunities to be more creative or more innovative or bridge gaps that we currently don't know how to bridge. And so I think that I think being clear which or under what conditions you're doing one versus the other is a kind of important first step.
I love the framing of divergence and convergence. And I think, again, a lot of the emphasis has been on convergence.
Yeah,
We can do this faster. We can
right,
do this
right.
with fewer people. We can do more iterations of things. And so that's why the content world has been the first place that CMOs have adopted these tools. The divergence thing is so much harder. And
Yes,
part of it is that there's some technical know-how required in order to build new things and so it's hard to imagine, oh my gosh, we could create a whole new customer experience and tools and things if you don't know some of the aspects of the tools that you're working and don't have somebody like an engineer on your team
it's
to do
true.
it.
Yeah, just I'm thinking if it's a team sport, which I utterly agree it is, then think about what's the composition of that team and is it diverse enough or is it too homogeneous in terms of expertise and background? And so if you're using it to pursue other paths, be creative, be thoughtful about things we haven't tried before, then probably the composition of the team needs to reflect that goal.
Yeah, because and it's funny because if you said in pre-Gen AI, you said, "Hey, we want to build we're going to have an innovation competition in our company, and you're going to get together a team and come up with ideas and present." And these innovation days were things that used to happen all the time.
Yes,
And you would try to make sure that I have an engineering person on my team, maybe even a legal person on my team,
right,
sales, a marketer, and you create this sort of full intelligent group, not too unwieldy, but enough that you could sort of really brainstorm and do something interesting. I think there's a tendency now a little bit more, well, we can do so much with these tools. Maybe we don't need all that. And that'll be an interesting part of it.
right, right,
Because
right. Because you have virtual engineers in the
exactly.
world, right? You're grabbing their ideas and content, um, potentially indiscriminately, but that's why the experimentation is so necessary. I do think and worry about, I think we need more systems thinking, more more thinking about downstream consequences, right? So if, for example, as you say, and I agree, much of the experimentation has been on the convergence or efficiency side, um, we haven't fully thought through what will that mean, right? If we can do a lot of the tasks, and of course the group that gets most discussed here is the sort of entry level, the entry level hires, right? So many of the tasks that they were called upon to do, the reviewing the literature, so some of the frontline interviews and so forth, cranking through data are the first things to be replaceable by Gen AI. But then we fail to say, okay, that's great, right? We don't need all those people. Now what? Like, where do the mid-level people come from?
Right.
What's the future of our workforce like? And how do people develop skills and judgment and perspective without going through those experiences? We don't know the answer to a lot of these questions.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. And there's what's funny about some of this is so marketers were now probably spend more on IT than IT does. And they also created all sorts of data risks for those companies. And now that possibility of risk is even higher. So there are downstream implications on both a hiring standpoint, but also legal, ethical, all sorts of other things that they need to think. And we're not going to go there. Where I want to
Right,
get back
right.
to now is first of all, I want to ask those that are present here, if you all, what do you think is holding you back in terms of experimenting, whether it's getting budget for experimenting or actually driving the experimentation? And so I'd love it if you all want to put it questions in chat for Amy, or if you want to come on camera, just raise your hand
Yeah,
and
please.
we'll grab you.
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk about model, a model, and we're going back to as a CMO, their job is both to help deliver in the short term and have a vision for the long term,
Right.
right? And that's hard.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
hard.
Yep.
And the long term is where this experiment, because the seeds that you're planting today are going to be the oak trees tomorrow, right? So it's a
Hmm.
hard thing because what great CMOs do is the salesperson's thinking about the quarter, the CMO is thinking about the future of the company, both in terms of who are our new markets, who are our new products, how are we going to build a moat around our organization that will make it harder
Right.
for competitors to steal our customers. All these things are
Yeah.
in play, but
Yeah.
experimentation is at the center of it, right?
Absolutely. And I think the first question just popped in there is kind of along these same lines, but it's we will always feel here's how the pull of the now will always win unless we are thoughtful and mature and override it. Meaning the pull of doing what is needed right now, the urgent, this is the old Eisenhower matrix where the urgent crowds out the important. So maturity, wisdom, experience, perspective are all about insisting that we attend to the important. And the future is important, right? But it never feels important today. I'll worry about that later. I just have to get through this agenda, these meetings, this whatever, right? So there isn't one best way to ensure that we attend to the future. But there are many ways not to do it, right? There's a thousand excuses and reasons to sort of just grind through today's workload. And so I guess all I'm really saying is you can do it, but you've got to be thoughtful and deliberate about it, and you have to make it explicit out loud, make it a team sport. How can we ensure that we are doing today what will be needed some future date to continue to enjoy the success we're enjoying today, right? And it is not a given, right? It is not a given that just because we're successful today, we'll be successful tomorrow. Nothing fails like success. So we are programmed to underinvest in the future, but successful organizations find ways to get around that programming.
The person who's responsible for me reaching out to you is here with us, Amy King. And I'm going to ask Amy, if you don't mind coming on camera and joining and asking you the question that you put in chat so that you can, at least contribute to the conversation because you are the one responsible for it. Do you mind doing that, Amy?
It's a great name.
Drew. And thank you, Amy. It's really great to meet you. I loved your book.
Thank you.
We've used it across our marketing team and have really, I think, proudly built a team that is very comfortable in sharing intelligent failure and using that as a learning point. Um, where I think I'm struggling a little bit, and I really love the discussion on complex failures and systems thinking, because I think in a modern marketing world, marketing really lives in the center of an interdepartmental system,
Yeah.
and we're often dealing with things that
Mm.
don't necessarily perform to the level that we expected, but attribution can be really hard to nail down
Hmm.
when there's so many variables that could have led to that cause. I think added to that, we often have other leaders in other departments somewhat skeptical of that marketing team asking for money, and so I just wondered in that system world, if you have recommendations on how, sometimes when we apply let's share our intelligent failures to
Yeah.
that model, we kind of, from our outside stakeholders, get a little bit of, well, why did you spend the money and you shouldn't get more? So how do you kind of work on, in our marketing bubble, we're doing well with this, but how do we spread it to
Right,
outside
right.
stakeholders in a way that still engenders trust, while also not instilling doubt?
Yeah, it's hard. It's like your part of your job is sort of external education, but just influencing other departments to embrace this mindset which is a mindset of of smart risk taking and a mindset of systems thinking, as you say. And I don't think there's one right way, but I do think you can be influential in leading a conversation. And it's educare, education, the root of that word is, to lead people towards something. And you're not trying to push it, you're trying to pull. You're trying to ask good questions, to ask the kind of question like, what might happen if? Uh, Help them. I used to work for wonderful guy, Larry Wilson, who would bring senior teams together and say, imagine the company that if it existed today, would put yours out of business. So what do they do? What do they like? How do customers see them? And it was just sort of a fun, creative exercise. You fill up the flip charts with the attributes of that company. And everybody, because everybody was there, they're a little frustrated. Yeah, we're a little bureaucratic here, we're a little slow there, we're a little stuck in and so they had fun with it, right? And then you'd say, okay, now be them. How do we get you there, right? So it was almost like they've had this, emotional connection with their idealized company. And it's like, okay, you're the ones who are going to get us there. So however you do it, your job is to kind of, with warmth and respect, engage them because they're not stupid, right? They can see the very real risks you can see about, what happens if we don't take smart risks? What happens if we just stick with doing things the way we've always done them?
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Drew, if it's okay, I have one more question, just a
Please.
little shorter.
Thank you.
Um, so I love the example in the book of the nurses who, were afraid to record incidents. We're actually in my company's we're software for healthcare technology,
Ah,
and that one rang very true. And I think one of the things we've struggled a little bit this year because the healthcare landscape in the US has been so uncertain is understanding from an attribution perspective as we do take risks what's a behavioral problem because something's happened in the market.
yeah,
So an intelligent failure, but one outside of our control versus ones that maybe it was our own campaign design or the way we
yeah.
executed that was the problem. And I'm just wondering how you help companies kind of navigate between those kinds of determinations.
I think it's a really good question, and the answer lies in the quality of the debrief or after action review or failure analysis or whatever terminology. I think it is actually successes and failures alike, but it is a leadership responsibility to make sure we use our own experience to teach us, right? To learn as much, if we've invested in it, let's learn from it. Let's get the money's worth. And so, a thoughtful process of, understanding something that didn't go the way we had truly hoped is it nearly always starts with what happened. Like our temptation and our instincts are who did it, what's the root cause, what's to blame. Stay away from that question initially. We'll get there eventually, but first we have to say what actually happened and try to describe what happened from as many perspectives as possible. And usually, I mean, it's more likely than any other outcome that what we will learn is it was a complex failure, which means there were things that we did suboptimally, and there were things outside our control in the external world that we didn't see coming and could not have seen coming. And so it's a kind of mix of those things. Now, guess what you can't change? The things outside your control. But guess what you can change? Your own behavior processes and so on. So all we can do from those learning conversations is identify the very few things that actually are not necessarily low-hanging fruit, but things that we can and are eager to improve. Right? So we will make those changes. And then, with respect to the absolutely out of the blue things, nothing you can do about that. With respect to the things that are external, but if we'd been a little more diligent, we could have known. Yeah, let's get on those because when we look at sort of how we contributed, some of it is sins of omission, not just commission, right? So some of it is things we did, shouldn't have done that, but a great deal of it is things we failed to do. The extra vigilance, the listening to the customers or the listening to lower levels or what have you that was really there for the asking, but we didn't do it. So it's honesty in the sort of the reflection, the soul searching. And I don't mean to describe something that goes on and on and on. No, this can be very efficient indeed, but it is honest and thoughtful. And truly, the goal is to find out what we can change so we can be better next time.
I love it. Well, thank you, Amy King, and appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you introducing the book to me. We're going to run out of time pretty quickly, Amy, but one thing that is clear, if you are lucky enough to work for a CEO who fosters a culture of innovation and experimentation, it's a beautiful thing. Is there any hope if you
Yes.
work for a CEO who doesn't inherently understand that
Yep.
notion of intelligent failure to actually, other than handing them their book and this book like a bottle
Good
of
idea.
soap,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
in the old days, Any hope for in your experience where a CEO sort of got eventually came to understand the things that they were the failures that they were inherent in their
Mhm.
inability to foster innovation in their company because of their approach?
Yes. So I think, there's really a two possibilities if you're in that situation, and one is that there are ways to, and you can help them change and start to see things differently. And I'll come right back to that one. But the other is that you accept their limitations and you resolve simply to be running the absolute best possible learning-oriented department you can, including, with your peers, with your direct reports and on down. So, sometimes it's like I don't have a magic wand, so there's no sort of guarantee that you can change them. But let's assume that that's at least a possibility. And I think the best way, again, as I was talking with Amy, it's sort of through inquiry. Most CEOs got where they are because they were willing to at least take some risks, and they have had experiences in their life where they kind of took a deep breath and went for it. And so, sort of guiding them to see, both in their own experience, their own lived experience, the valuable role of smart risks and deep learning, as well as the simple thought experiment of what happens when we don't take enough risks, right? Because there's the there's the possibility of, failing, any intelligent failure, that's always a possibility, but there's an almost certain and preventable failure that just happens later if you don't do anything differently today.
I love it. That's yeah. So you fight it till you fight the good fight, and then if
Yep.
you can't, you do what you can.
Right. And then
And of
buffer.
course,
Yeah. Buffer your people.
exactly, and build a little culture within that. So is there, because we're at the last second here, one micro habit leaders can start tomorrow to foster psychological safety?
Absolutely. The one micro habit is ask more questions, but good questions, not, you know, how the hell did that happen? But, yeah, thank you for that clear line of sight. How can I help? What are you learning? What are you seeing? What are customers saying? What are our competitors doing? Whatever. Show up as the most curious version of yourself. That creates psychological safety nearly instantaneously if it's genuine, right? If you're asking questions and you're willing to listen to the responses, that is almost definitionally psychological safety. You've told people, you've telegraphed, I genuinely want to know what's inside your head, and I'm all ears.
Love it. Last question. Is there a failure you're grateful for?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think the failure I'm most grateful for, and without having time to really do this justice, was the failure of my very first research project, where I was trying to show that better teams had fewer errors, and pretty simple. I don't think that would have been a terribly interesting paper, but what ended up happening again was that some teams had remarkably higher willingness to report errors. Now that was interesting. And that led me down a path I never would have thought of going on my own. So that failure to support my hypothesis opened up an enormous and far more interesting and enriching research program.
I love it. Well, thank you, Amy, for helping us reframe failure as not something to fear, but as something to pursue with purpose. And CMOs, please go forth and fail in a very
Yeah.
positive way.
Smart, small, new,
Yeah,
right?
smart, small, new, and have at it. Amy's book, The Right Kind of Wrong, is an essential read or listen especially if you're serious about innovation, and why wouldn't you be? So your homework this week: don't run from failure, but find one worth learning for. Let's give Amy a virtual round of applause. Yay! Thank you
Thank
so much
you.
for joining us.
It was great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.